In this section of the book, we're going to be talking about the process of science. And in the last section, we were also just talking about biology. It's the study of living things. And when scientists want to know um, something, we use the scientific method. So the scientific method is listed in your text. I'm sorry for scrolling so much, right here. And it's going to be really important that you know like the basics of how that works. So, when we're testing, we usually test something because first we made an observation. So, an observation is just something you notice. So, for example, if a scientist noticed that um, every time she opens the back door, the birds in her backyard stop singing. Well, that's an observation that she would be making. Then further, she could go and ask a question. And a question would be obviously about the birds stopping singing. A question could be, why are they not singing? Or what is causing them to stop singing? What makes them sing in the first place? So she would go and ask a question. From there, you can form a hypothesis. For example, maybe she has a hypothesis that the bird switches songs whenever they think there's a predator nearby. Okay, so that could be a good hypothesis that she has. Um, other hypotheses could be something that like the birds have a variety of songs regardless of what's happening, or that the hypothesis is that it's just a mistake, it just happens that way, but it's just by chance. However, in this situation, probably the most likely hypothesis is when the birds have something that they think is dangerous or a warning, then they'll a predator, for example, then they'll switch their songs. Okay, so say the same scientist wants to go test that hypothesis of certain bird species in her backyard, and the songs that they sing, and how that they change their song whenever they hear a predator or they see a predator. So all of that would be her hypothesis and what she wants to test. But what did she initially observe? Going backwards, she initially observed that every time she let open the door, the birds sing their song. Maybe she noticed that every time her dog or her cat went through the little doggy door, cat door, then they changed their song. So at first you always make an observation, and then you ask a question, and then you form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is just an educated guess at the answer to a question that you have. So you need to never feel bad at all that your hypothesis is wrong, because basically proving the hypothesis wrong is one of the major goals of science. When you can eliminate incorrect answers, you get closer and closer to the correct answer. So you're never trying to prove anything right in science. And so, because of that, you need to not have a big ego in science, because you're actually always trying to prove that your own hypothesis was false, that you were incorrect, and that you are going to try again, and you're just going to show that. The correct wording is that you're going to show that the hypothesis was incorrect. But sometimes you have a correct hypothesis, and then you can retest and find out more information, and that's great too. Um, so after a hypothesis is done, then you make a prediction based on your hypothesis. So the prediction is basically the outcome that you expect to get. So it's basically your guess at the end outcome of the experiment. And then you'll do the experiment and you'll analyze the results and you'll say, yes, it was supported by the hypothesis. And then you report that, or you say, no, it was not supported by the hypothesis. And then you go back and you form a new hypothesis and go through the testing again. So those are the general like steps of the scientific method. Remember that hypothesis is an educated guess. Um, Going backwards in your book, there's some important points that I want to hit on. We'll go to this picture right here. Some things that are important to know is that in science, sometimes in testing, scientists will use something called a placebo or a placebo effect. And a placebo is basically a fake version of a drug or treatment to measure against the real drug or treatment. And sometimes patients are given a placebo so that they have what's called a control group. So in science, we have a control group. They are the group, and it doesn't have to be people. It could be plants. It could be bacteria. But that's the group where everything is kept the same and normal and no changes were made. And then science always has a variable group. And the variable group is the one that has something added or changed or manipulated to make things different for them. So, in an experiment, you should always pick the subjects at random. What's the point of having random subjects? The point of having a randomized subjects is to remove some of your own bias or some of to get more real results, so that you're not pushing for the answer that you want. If you had a human experiment about changing foods or eating or something like that, and you put all the healthier people in one group and all the, less healthy people in another group, well, then you're not really getting good results, like true data based off of that information. In an experiment, you really need to watch out for factors that influence the outcomes of your experiment. These are called variables. So for example, if I have a group of kindergartners and I'm trying to see if more recess is better for them, and I give one group one recess in the morning, and I give the other group a recess in the morning and the afternoon, but I also feed the afternoon ones, then I've added in another variable. I've said not only are you going to have 2 recesses, but you guys get extra snacks. And so that's obviously not going to be a fair experiment if the extra recess helps the kids or not. So you have to be careful about the factors that you add in called variables, and make sure that you're only ever testing one. So when you have a hypothesis that people have tested, and let's see if we're near this. If you have a hypothesis that has been tested and it's been shown to be correct, then other scientists might pick it up, hopefully, and they might start testing it. And if they show that it's correct, and they do it with, on using different different, maybe slightly different conditions, and try to follow your directions, but try to keep it somewhat the same. If they repeat the experiment over and over and over again, eventually you can have that hypothesis develop into a theory. And a theory is a very solidly well accepted thing in science that scientists across the world have usually tested this hypothesis and found it to be correct. So it has now, so basically now it's considered a theory. So a theory is a lot more reliable than a hypothesis because it's been tested so many times. So in common English, we use the word theory very casually. We're like, I have a theory about this, how this happened. Okay, that's not a theory. That's just a hypothesis. That's an educated guess. So try to start using that word correctly around your friends, and they'll just be really annoyed with you. But at least you'll be using the word correctly. We'll go to Sir Francis Bacon, who was the first person to document the scientific method. Okay, so a few more things that I want to point out. Sometimes there are correlations. So a correlation doesn't mean that one thing caused the other, but a correlation can mean that two things tend to be related. For example, the higher you go in education, usually you get a job that's better paying. It doesn't necessarily cause one another, but it can, but they are correlated. Say that you could say with recess, with kindergarten recess, that kids that had more recesses were happier with their kindergarten experience. So there was a correlation there. Correlation means two things are connected and seem to work together, and they can be opposites too. They can be not just, it doesn't have to always be um, both positive. You can have some that are negative. So, for instance, like the longer you stay on a low carb diet, the more cranky or like the less happy you are, um, or something like that. So, sometimes they can go in opposite directions, but basically it just means that they are related, have some kind of relationship. Eventually, after you've run a lot of experiments, your work can be peer reviewed, where you have other scientists go and look at your work and see if they can find any holes. And what's so awesome about that process is that my work that has been peer reviewed has gotten chopped up into tiny little bits by a lot of researchers when I've done like my environmental research studies each year. But then having your work chopped up into little pieces and all the holes shot through it, it basically makes you go back and fix it and find all the mistakes. And then when you can finally present it in a solid way, it's pretty awesome feeling to be able to build something that's pretty strong in the end. Um, there's two types of data that I want to talk to you about. One is qualitative and one is quantitative. So qualitative um, is more like results that you see or get that are not um, they're not as concrete. So they can be something like happiness or like pass fail, but without, an exact number, eye color, or if these were interviews that you did and people were just talking about their experiments or experiences, I'm sorry. Or like if you had a description of the weather outside, like it's warm and or it's cloudy or it's sunny. So, I feel happy or I feel sad. So those are qualitative um, observations in an experiment, and they can be valid, but they're not necessarily tied to a number. Now, another way is to look at data is the quantitative way. And so the quantitative way is actually tied to a hard number. For example, what's the exact height of the kindergartners in the class, the average, what's the shortest kindergartner to the tallest kindergartner. It's very concrete. How long does it take people to do a certain task? What's the average weight of a sumo wrestler? What's the average length of a red light? What's the average age of an Olympian? Or what's the average distance to a planet? Or what's the average Americans have in savings? Or average temperature of your herbal tea or whatever. So that's always tied to a number. So there's qualitative that is not, it's more descriptions, and quantitative that is more tied to a hard number. So those are the main things that I wanted to go over with you. Well, I have another example. If you have a scientist that wishes to test an antibiotic's ability to treat stubborn bacterial infections. So let me go to this. Let me go to, oh, I am going the wrong way. I apologize. If you have a scientist that wants to test a certain bacteria on mice and see how they recover. So she takes a bunch of mice and infects them. And then she's like, okay, these were the results. What was she missing in that experiment? So she had the variable group that she infected, but she was missing the control group. So the control group is really important so you can see how the regular mice are reacting with or without the bacterial infection. So in that one, they were missing the control group. Okay. So that's all I'm going to ask you guys, and I hope you guys have a great day.